we have both been playing Metaphor Fantasio, and I've heard it said so many different ways. I like to say Fantasio, almost like Disney's Fantasio. Isn't that a thing? I don't know.
I think it
Um,
is. This is the wrong screen.
whoa! I was about to say there's no gameplay there. Yeah, Metaphor ReFantazio, if you're not aware, is the latest game from actually the creators of the Persona series. Basically, what happened was the director of that series and a lot of people who've been working on that series for a long time, after Persona 5, they were just like, we want to do something new. And so they formed their own team, and Atlus kind of like retained them. And so the Persona series is still going forward, but it's got a new leadership, like kind of leading that, like a changing of the guard. Whereas the old Persona team is now made this. And I think there is a lot of Persona DNA in this 100%, but there is so much that's also new that I think it's kind of the Elden Ring of this sort of style of gameplay, where it's introduced a very similar system, but with enough tweaks that has got a lot of new people in. And, you are one of those new people. So I'd love to hear your perspective on how you've been enjoying Metaphor thus far.
I wanted to ask, so just to go back to when was this game announced? Like, did we know 2 years ago that Metaphor was coming?
It was sort of announced not too long after Persona, but it was so early at that point that, like, if you weren't really following Persona and that sort of team's movements, you would have completely missed it. But then about 2 years ago, it re-emerged, and it was a lot of like, oh, this game is still actually in development, like it's still coming. And that's when they just kicked off like the marketing for it, and it's just been sustained since then.
Okay, because I feel like this game came out of nowhere, honestly, at least on my radar, where just on a day or the month leading up to it, it's like, oh yeah, that Persona game's coming out. And I was a bit confused because what do you mean they're not making, is Persona 6, like what's going on? So this was completely new to me. And it's funny because going into this, we got review code. It was a late Saturday evening. I think I'd finished, like I was looking for my next game to play basically. And I knew like there are things like Call of Duty coming up, and there's a few things in the back burner which I haven't gotten around to. But it was one Saturday evening, and it was late. It was maybe 11 in the evening, and I just saw Metaphor. And I had an actual conversation. I mean, I didn't verbalize a conversation, but internally I had a conversation of, am I really going to commit to like a full 100 hours plus to this game? Because unlike you, when I start a game, like I feel compelled to finish it. Like I feel, unless I'm absolutely hating it, like I don't like playing a game 30, 40 hours and then not seeing it end. So it is a thing of, okay, am I committing to this? And I played the first hour or two and I was like, yeah, it's very stylish. It looks cool. Like the turn-based combat is neat, and I'm sure there's a lot of depth to it. And fast forward, I've played, I think, about 25 hours now. So I've probably barely done like the first.
Already?
Holy
shit.
I've probably barely played the introduction, given that this is the scope of these games. But I'm thoroughly enjoying this game. It's got me, and we'll talk a lot about why it's got me. But let's just say that like I want to finish this game, and at some point I would like to revisit maybe Persona 5 to see the two differences, because you've said there's a lot of similarities in DNA and how the game works and whatever. And I can kind of understand it now. I suppose kicking off with, in Persona, I've always heard, you've got to manage your time. There's a calendar, there's days, you've got to decide what you're going to do on certain days. And I never quite understood how that worked because I've never played a Persona game. So in my head, I always thought, okay, in Persona, do you wake up as your character, then you've got 30 minutes to go do whatever in that day. Like I never understood how the system works, but now I get it, where it's the same in Metaphor, where you start a day and you can do two activities in that day. So whether, for example, it's funny though how it's broken up. The morning is always a cinematic or a cutscene, and then your afternoon and your evenings are when you do things. So, for example, during the afternoon, you can go, I want to go do that dungeon. That's going to take the whole afternoon. And it shows you a little icon saying like, oh, this is going to actually pass time if you commit to this. And that's how the time's broken down. And now I understand the appeal or the system of, you've got to be careful. Not careful, but you've got to choose how you want to do things, because eventually you get to a point in the game where, there's a lot of things you can do. There's a lot of things you can level up. There's a lot of people you can talk to. There are a lot of like side quests or bounties you can pursue. So how do you choose to break it up? And there's something, I don't know what it is, but there's something so satisfying, or soothing is the wrong word, but there's something like nice about that rhythm of, I wake up today, I tick off a thing, go to sleep, wake up the next day, do something else, pass some time till I get to the main objective, which is due in 10 days time, whatever it is. I'm just enjoying that loop, that gameplay loop of doing things on a daily system and then progressing the story like that. And I'm sure other games, similar games exist, but I've not played a JRPG like this, that comes to mind. So it's completely new to me, and I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I also can't think of another game that makes time so purposeful. I think it's funny that you just came off playing Dead Rising, because I think that's another game that kind of takes that approach where it's, I know a lot of people look at this and they go, oh, I hate feeling pressured with time, because like that is my life, that is my day to day, and I 100% get that. But I think it adds such a layer of, you have to think about how you're spending time in this game. And I think it gives weight to your decisions that a lot of other open world-ish, hub-based, whatever RPGs just don't. Because how many times have you heard that thing of like, oh, there is this big threat to the world, but hey, I can go do 10 side quests for 20 hours and that threat doesn't really move or, become worse as a result. The Zelda thing, the Breath of the Wild thing, where Zelda's waiting to be rescued, but hey, I've got to go and find every nook and cranny in this
100%.
world before I can go. And I think a lot of people don't think about that, and that's totally fine, but it's sort of like narrative dissonance that I think the Persona series especially like tackles head on. I do think, it's a system you have to get used to, because there are, at least in the older games, there were very easy ways to like work yourself into a corner where you have definitely not spent your time correctly, but that only really manifests way down the line.
Yeah.
And then you're in a sort of like a bit of trouble because you don't have the flexibility to kind of correct that. I think they've got a lot better with that over each game. Like I think Persona 5 was a bit more forgiving of that, and Metaphor ReFantazio, I think, gives you a lot more flexibility in that regard as well. But it does that without taking away the importance of thinking about how you're going to spend your days, thinking about which attributes you're trying to level up, which relationships you're trying to move forward, which in turn affect like the effectiveness of those party members in combat, etc., etc. There's a lot to consider, and I think that can definitely feel overwhelming. But I think based off what I've played so far, Metaphor does probably the best job of introducing those things in a manner that makes sense. You don't feel completely lost as to what to start with and what directions to go in, and in turn end up wasting a lot of time at the beginning of the game. So in that regard, I can see why people have been onboarded in a much better way, and as a result are probably enjoying the game a lot more. It is really interesting to me that like you and Darren, having never played this series, jumped into one that seems the most odd, because it's like this weird fantasy setting with very flowery, interesting writing, as opposed to the slice of life modern day Persona series. But it's cool. I think the setting is really interesting and really different from Persona. I think it's got a real Game of Thrones vibe to it, which I am definitely enjoying. And the way it's structured its overall narrative so far, with the idea of there's almost like this popularity contest that you've got to win. It's super, it's very different. And I really like how that's framing the days that go by. So yeah, I'm having a great time with it, even though I've like played maybe 7 or 8 hours of it.
Where are you in the story?
Like,
what's the last thing that's happened?
Very light spoilers for the beginning if you're worried, but it's basically I got to the funeral of the king, who literally dies in the first 30 seconds of the game.
Oh my god, spoilers.
And that is where I see the game now like kicking off. It's like,
Okay,
cool,
yeah.
we've introduced the combat to you, we've introduced this idea of sort of the day system, but now you are given the chance to actually mess with these systems in an open way. We're not going to like, hold your hand through these things. And that's like 6-7 hours in, but
Yeah.
I think they give you enough interesting things to do in that time that both teach you and keep you engaged, which I think has been a core problem with the Persona series, even in 5, and why a lot of people bounce off in the first few hours. So it's props to the team for, I think, getting that right for the very first time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny you said it, because it is like, whoa, like it took you 8 hours to get to, where the main premise of the game actually kicks off. And that's why I asked, because like, I don't actually know if you've seen, like, I think you have an idea of what the game is, but have you actually seen, where it's going, whatever?
Yeah.
Yeah, but what's also been so interesting to me is that, again, like, I've never touched a Persona game. I've like seen screenshots, I've barely seen gameplay. Honestly, it's just one of those franchises where I'm pretty sure I'd enjoy it, but I've just not engaged with it in any form. This game does not provide you a huge open world to run through and explore. Which I just didn't expect. It's literally just hubs with cutscenes to dungeons, whatever. And I thought, yeah, that kind of makes sense, because in Persona, you typically just in one town, right? Or one city. And
yeah.
Yeah. So I was like, oh, okay, so I guess that makes sense. But it's weird, because now I'm seeing like, oh, this is how this game's structured. And it is a thing of, it is a lot of information initially. And they do onboard you, right? Like, don't get me wrong, it's not a criticism, but there is a lot of information to like wrap your head around.
Yes.
But the moment you get into that rhythm, like I said earlier, of, oh, okay, there's a day system. You need to figure out how you're going to structure your days. The moment you figure that out, it just feels good to play. I mean, we haven't even got into the turn-based combat, which itself is really good as well. I just wanted to touch on one thing, though. When you mentioned Dead Rising earlier, this is a very different time system. Just to be clear, like Dead Rising, there's a persistent clock, which is like, okay, you've got to get your shit done. Whereas here, it's like, you just have to choose how you want to spend your time, but you don't have to like rush off to do something or whatever. It's just you literally deciding how you're going to do your day. So from that point of view, I don't find it stressful at all. It's more just am I going to talk to this person now? Am I going to go, talk to that random person to up some other stats of mine, whatever? But just on the combat itself, like Persona turn-based, it's got all the things I'd expect from a turn-based game today, but there's a lot of depth to it. It's interesting, because remember, I'm coming from a Final Fantasy point of view, where I know Final Fantasy, that franchise, like inside out, all the turn-based games. So I see a lot of similarity, and it's obviously not unique to Final Fantasy, but that's my frame of reference. And you see the typical thing of like, if you're in the back row, you take less damage. If you're in the front row, you do more damage, etc., etc. You can guard to take less damage, but you give up your turn. But where this game, I think, shines, and I'm sorry I keep comparing it to Final Fantasy. Again, that's just my frame of reference. But there's archetypes, which it's kind of like the job system in Final Fantasies of yesteryear. Where so as any of your characters, you can choose what archetypes are going to be. So, and that's the typical. I can have one character as my warrior who's going to be like offensive, do some heavy physical damage. I can have somebody as a mage who's going to do fire, magic and elemental damage, and then I can have a healer who's going to be my support. The thing is, Metaphor has so many. Like, I've unlocked, and you get like your default, like a warrior, okay? But then there are things that warrior upgrades to. There are things that a mage can upgrade to. And I'm still 25 hours in unlocking new jobs and upgrading existing ones, and there's just an insane level of depth there, because you can get even more in the weeds of, okay, you can do certain jobs, but you can also choose to inherit some other abilities from other jobs that you've perfected. So it's like, I can be a mage who has a high magic stat, but I can also inherit like healing from the healer archetype, because I want to have like a bit of a hybrid character or whatever. So I'm sure people who want to do number crunching and min-maxing and just doing crazy things towards the end of the game are having an absolute blast mixing and matching different builds or characters or whatever. So yeah, tons of depth in that front, and it's fun to like play through all of them. I mean, you also like, I find that there are side quests or there's certain things that kind of incentivize you to experiment and try, and you're not locked into a thing. Like, it's pretty not rewarding. It's pretty lenient in that, you know, you obviously if you're gonna play as the warrior, you're gonna have to level it up, whatever. But you get items that let you fast track that leveling, and you do get them like pretty abundantly. So you'll burn through them quickly, but you must never feel like, oh, I can't mess around with jobs, whatever, because they're actually really good at giving you tools and resources to like fast track something if you just want to experiment a bit, or, you know, get a high level to a certain archetype, whatever. Yeah, so it's been fun seeing all the different kinds and seeing like, it's also that typical thing of they excelled one thing but they're weak in another thing. They've got elemental bonuses on certain fronts, but they've got weaknesses on other fronts. So it's quite cool to see how do you balance, like, what is a good party composition, you know, what is the correct mix of characters, and, you know, what is just fun to play with, or what is best for the situation at hand. And, you know, it's so easy to change between them.
Yeah, I think I really like the depth that's been added to this combat, because I've always considered Persona's turn-based combat probably one of the best, you know, out there. But I think it was very easy in the past to settle into the same sort of rhythm for every combat scenario, where, especially in 5, they emphasized exposing weaknesses. So a lot of enemies have, you know, an affinity to block certain amounts of damage and be weak to certain elements or certain types of damage. And in Persona 5, you were constantly trying to expose that, because when you delivered weak damage to an enemy, it would sort of like down them. And if you could down all of them in a turn, then you could do an all-out attack where every member in your party would do like some sort of damage to them. And that was kind of like your rhythm. You were trying to expose those weaknesses, get them down, do all-out attacks, and try and mitigate your enemy taking turns, which, you know, works really well, but it forces you to play in a certain way. And especially when in the past, you know, your party members each had a persona, which was like an archetype, like a healer, a mage, a fire person, a, you know, wind person, whatever. And your main character was the one that kind of consolidated those powers into a sort of hybrid. So there was less flexibility in terms of you could change your party composition, but that was ultimately your job system. You couldn't change what jobs each character had. So from that perspective, Metaphor is a massive upgrade. The fact that you can keep certain party members that have their own stats, but then change the archetype that they use, which then, you know, utilizes those stats. And I also think that the turn system is a much better method of balancing exploiting weaknesses while also thinking about how your turns play out. So the big change here is the ability to pass your turn, and also the fact that like exploiting a weakness gives you back half a turn. So you start each round where you have, like, for each character in your party, you have a turn. So you have 3 people in your party, you have 3 turns. If you expose a weakness, you get half a turn back, which can be an action that a character takes. If you pass your turn, you use half a turn to move to the next person in your party. So if you're like, cool, this enemy is really weak to fire damage, but the character I'm on has no way to use that, and the only way they can do damage is physical damage that the enemy is actually quite defensive against or can block, then you would likely want to pass your turn and, you know, manage your turn resource like that to make the best of your turn. And the enemies work in the same fashion, which is really it's a cool thing. Yeah, it's a cool thing to balance and to like think about in a turn-based game, rather than just like, it's this character's turn, then it's this character's turn. Then I think it's very similar to the way that Final Fantasy VII back in the day, or I guess 6 introduced this, but like the active time battle, where it's still turn-based, but you're taking into account how characters recharge their turn and when to use their turns.
Yeah.
It's a fundamental rethinking of how turn-based combat works, and I think this is like an evolution of that, and I really, really like it. I think I was telling you earlier this week, it's going to be tough to go back to a Persona where you don't have this level of depth in the combat, and I don't think that makes it impossible, but I do think it's such a big change that it's going to set the tone going forward for at least this series, and I think a lot of other turn-based games are going to look at this as inspiration. I think it's a really, really good combat system that just has a ton of depth, and I'm excited to like pick it apart and start, exposing all these new archetypes and using them, and really thinking about how I'm going to make the best out of my party. So from that aspect, I think it's really bolstered combat, and I think the other big improvement is just the way you move around the world and actually get into combat. The fact that you can kill lower level enemies without hopping into the turn-based aspect is really cool. It's
nice.
It's an element they pulled from Persona 5 where you could only do that in non-main dungeons. Like in main dungeons you couldn't do that, but they had this like farming dungeon that you could take on during every day to kind of like grind and level up, and they allowed you to do it there. I think making that a core pillar of the gameplay is smart, especially when if you attack enemies in the open world before you engage them in turn-based combat, you can actually stun them so that they enter combat stunned. But by the same token, if you get attacked by them or you mistime your attacks, then you enter the turn-based phase stunned. So you've got to balance like, oh, this enemy's really tough. I'm actually not going to try and stun them beforehand. I'm just going to hop straight into turn-based combat as opposed to taking a bit of a risk and trying to stun them beforehand. It's really, really cool. I think, again, it just makes moving around the dungeons a lot more interesting rather than the sort of Pokemon approach where you're moving through, you're colliding with enemies, you have to fight them, and you rinse and repeat that. So I love it. I really think they've made some cool decisions.
Yeah, I was going to just two things. So the first thing is that I feel that, turn-based games have been around for decades. I feel like this is almost like a greatest hits where it's taken the best lessons and put them into one package. Because like it ticks all the boxes. Like we've said, really good turn-based system, good like job system and the archetype feature, whatever. Just all the cool things, that you'd want from a turn-based game, like in one place. I feel like it's ticked all the right boxes. And then secondly, to go back to that low level, the fact that you can just insta-kill them. I had such an interesting thought. It was earlier this week when I was playing, where I've actually just been ticking off all the side quests, and a part of me thinks like, oh, do I need to do this? Like, should I not just like main track a bit, whatever? But it kind of evens itself out, because like I ended up doing two big side quests, whatever. And I was maybe 2 or 3 levels or a couple levels higher than I needed to be for my next main dungeon. But then I just flew through that main dungeon. I could just one-hit everything, and I got through it so quickly. So from a time management point of view in real life, it's like I didn't, not that you feel punished for doing side quests, but I didn't feel like I'd wasted time doing the side quests. It's like, oh, it just made this main dungeon a breeze, where I could have done it the other way around, right? I could have done the main dungeon and then just breeze through those side quests. So it kind of like evens out, if that makes sense. And it's kind of nice to just at that point go to the main dungeon going, oh, so I ran out of footage. It was just nice to have the thing of like, oh yeah, I've spent some time like doing actual fights in these side quests. Now I can just focus on the main story and just like breeze through this main dungeon.
Yes,
I really enjoyed that.
I think it makes it for more respectful of your time, which, listen, I love Persona, I love 4 and 5, but I do think it, it's not perfect, and I do think there are moments where it is disrespectful of your time. It runs into these issues of like where it forces you into grinding, and in doing so forces you into running through dungeons, especially in 4. 4 was egregious with this, where it was like the only way to grind to get higher levels, which was kind of required, otherwise you'd just get smoked by like the story dungeons further down the line, was to rerun dungeons you had gone through and just go every single floor, getting into battles, doing that rinse and repeat, and it just felt like it was wasting your time purposefully. And I think 5 got slightly better with that. It still wasn't the best, but so far Metaphor is just so much better in that regard. And I think this is why a lot of people are clicking with it a bit more, because it feels like it's rewarding the time you spend with it rather than forcing you to do some not so great things to kind of get to the meaty, interesting bits. And even though, it's still a big time investment, I've seen a lot of people saying they were but like comfortably finishing this within 60, 70 hours, as opposed to I took 120 with Persona 5. And even then that was like, seems the average, not even like super completionist.
Yeah.
I think that's again because it's not forcing you to do shit that you don't want to do just so you can progress, which is a great change for me. So it's a great game. I'm glad that more people are playing this, because I think it's going to entice people to give other series of this ilk a try. And I think that's great, because the more people who play great games like Persona, and I assume Metaphor is going to become its own series going forward.
I'm sure.
I think it's just awesome, because I love these RPGs. I think they're really, really good. And I'm glad to see more people enjoying them and getting to experience them and kind of find the love in them that I've found over the years.
Yeah. We'll definitely be talking about it for weeks and months to come.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if I can finish this game before the end of the year, it will be a miracle.
It blows my mind. I've played it. It's 2 weeks now, right, since we got code. And I've thrown myself at this game, and I say like I've only done 25 hours. 25 hours is a long fucking time.
It's a lot of time. It's a lot of time.
But I think like in the grand scheme, like where am I in the story? Am I even like 10% of my way through, like 15, 20? Like, I don't know. The story still could go anywhere. So, but I'm enjoying it. That's, if you take one thing away from this review or in progress, whatever it's at, we're both enjoying the game. And it's long,
100%.
but we're both going to enjoy playing however long it is.
100%. It's great. I love the look of it, the flair, the music is so fucking good. But like, I'm not at all surprised by that, because it's the same composer from the previous Persona series, and it's a soundtrack I'm going to be listening to for years to come. I think that battle theme is just spectacular. It's so good. I'm having a great time, and I hope a lot of people are having a good time with this game. It seems to have come out the gate super strong in terms of sales, and I think it hits like the highest number of Steam players for this series. Well, blasting past Persona 5's numbers. So I think people are really, really curious about this and seemingly having a great time with it, which makes me happy.
Will it be RPG of the year? I wonder.
Who knows? I mean, there's been big ones. There's been, Rebirth. You got Dragon Age coming out next week or this coming week.
Time for all these games.
I mean, who knows? You've got Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, which came out earlier this year. Like, there are a lot of top tier RPGs that have come this year. So it's a tough thing. But I can already see Metaphor being really high on my just overall game of the year list for sure.
Oh no, 100%.